Very proud as being part of, citizen of Virginia, constituent, to introduce our next guest, Senator Mark Warner from the Commonwealth of Virginia. Senator Warner spent 20 years as a successful technology entrepreneur and business leader in Virginia before he was elected governor in 2001. When he left the governor's office in 2006, Virginia ranked as the best state for business, the best managed state, and the best state in which to receive a public education. Governor Warner was elected to the United States Senate in 2008, where he serves on the Senate Finance, Banking, Budget, and Rules Committee, as well as the Select Committee on Intelligence, where he is the vice chairman. He has been recognized as a national leader in fighting for our military men and women and veterans and working to design a bipartisan, comprehensive plan to address our country's debt and deficit. At a time when much in Washington seems to be stuck in a political standstill, Senator Warner stands out as a forward-thinking leader who's willing to cross partisan divides and bring people together to promote policies that encourage innovation and entrepreneurship and bring the federal government into the 21st century. So please, loud, warm welcome to Senator Mark Warner.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Senator, very much. Appreciate it. Well, thank you, Pat. Thank you for that introduction. If I can do half those things he just claimed that I'm doing pretty well. First of all, it is great for me to be here to follow Admiral Price. Apologies a little bit on the front end. I'm going to rush through this a bit because we're actually doing some stuff in Congress these days. Not all good necessarily, but we are doing some stuff. I want to compliment FireEye and more specifically Mandiant. I think about the Mandiant declassified report a few years back on some of the China activities and how that helped educate Congress about the nature of the threat and how extensive the threat is. Who would have thought a few years later we'd be now looking at a threat that is as big, if not bigger, in terms of Russian active measures that we've seen in terms of interference in our elections and things more that I'm rushing back now and as vice chair of Intel to deal with, and there's more to come on this. But it's great to be here. Let me also acknowledge, as Pat mentioned, my background is as a technology guy. I was very current circa year 2000, which puts me about a decade ahead of most of my colleagues at this point. But I'm not going to try with you guys to, show off my telecom or tech knowledge. But let me kind of roll through some of this stuff in terms of what's happening, what's not happening, how I kind of see the threat. We all know cyber has moved from the tech space to the CTO to the CEO. I think it is, as the Admiral indicated, it is that fourth domain of warfare. We've seen, again, it is increasingly an asymmetrical threat. You, again, know better than I the notion, and I thought the Admiral's point near the end about personal cyber hygiene, how no matter how good our network is, we're only as good in many ways as that individual in terms of how people can break through that individual's access into a network. We see that all the time in questions around ransomware, around hospitals. We've seen recently the San Francisco transit system lose a couple of days of fares because of these kind of attacks. And quite honestly, I'm not sure we are by anywhere prepared. An area that I've gotten involved in the last year, and if you guys think your business is great today, wait until we fully roll out the Internet of Things. We have 10 billion devices connected at this point to the Internet of Things. That number, based on projections I've looked at, will go up to about 34, 35 billion within the next 4 years. Virtually all of these devices, as somebody who was in the telecom business and was the first guy getting in the cell phone business back in the early 80s, all of these devices, as we get smaller and more compact, are built on interconnection and flexibility, but nobody has built in security into any of these devices. So the notion of, I'm going to come in a few minutes to some of the statistics around cyber workforce, but boy, oh boy, I say to everybody I can, if you're looking at a growth field, cyber is going to continue to be, for good and for bad. One of the things we're going to try to do, I'm working on legislation that would at least put in place that as the federal government purchases items, you'd have to purchase an item if it was IoT connected that it had some ability to be patchable. You had some ability to know if there was bad code. We have to start building in security. In many ways, we're already way behind as we move into an ever more networked world. Point number one. Point number two, why can't Congress get its act together on anything related to cyber? And actually, Pat mentioned part of this on this one. On most issues, it runs into partisanship. On this one, it really isn't partisanship. It really is, and I didn't fully appreciate this. I used to be governor before I was senator, so I came to the Senate, thought I was fairly well informed. I didn't realize how much of the dysfunction in the Senate, or in the Congress for that matter, was based upon committee jurisdictions. Since 2000, there have been, just in the Senate, 9 separate Senate committees that have held 28 hearings on cybersecurity, and the output of all that work has been one relatively modest information sharing bill. And as you all know, the threat in the last 8 or 9 years has exponentially increased, yet Congress' reaction has been quite slow to that. So one way I'm trying to deal with this is with a friend of mine, Republican Senator from Colorado, Cory Gardner. We've started the Senate Cyber Caucus to try to look across all of the jurisdictional silos to see how we might be better able to address that issue. And we've been able to take on, and I'm now at that age where the print's got to get bigger, I've got to bring out my glasses. We've covered topics including, obviously, cyber threats, options for cyber deterrence, federal support to states, cyber workforce challenges, but clearly a long way to go. And one of the areas that is most in need, I would argue, is data breach notification. Right now, we've got 48 different state laws. We've got no minimum data breach requirements. It is crazy. We've been working for 2 years on a solution set, very bipartisan. I have to tell you, my view on data breach needs to be that everybody needs to be in. No industry needs to have an opt-out. And candidly, it's my old guys in telecom are holding it up at this point. And we're still working on that. But in the meantime, if we can't get a full national data breach notification, one of the things we at least ought to be able to do is, in terms of public companies, make sure that there is appropriate data breach notification, at least under the SEC. Again, a little bit timely. I've been making part of this talk for some time, but it's remarkable to me, it used to be a public company board member, that Yahoo would think somehow that a 500 million user breach was not a material fact. And I mentioned that today, not to criticize simply Yahoo, although you may have heard that the Justice Department announced, once again, our friends at the Russian FSB and a couple of other known cyber hackers who are at least partially responsible for that. But the fact that Yahoo failed to file that as an SEC material fact is just stunning to me. But before we simply criticize Yahoo, know that fewer than 100 of the 9,000 publicly listed companies have ever listed any kind of cyber inclusion in their SEC filings. So if we can't get full broad-based cyber notification legislation, which we should, what we can at least do, and this is again bipartisan, we've got legislation introduced that in terms of securities law, the Cybersecurity Disclosure Act would at least make sure that if you're a publicly traded company, you've got at least one board member who has some background in cyber. We require board members to have background in finance. We require board members to have background in other areas. Increasingly, this has to be at the board level. Innovation and modernization. This may come as a shock. How many of you are here work inside the government? Federal government or state government? I know this will come as a shock to you guys, but we are not at the Fed level always the most innovative. I know that's a newsflash for the reporter here in front. I still get being from Virginia, the number of people who still come up to me, especially from the Intel community, and say, "Do you realize how little we finally heard from OPM? And what about my vulnerabilities?" So the challenges are pretty remarkable. One of the things on the good news piece, we did get into the defense authorization bill, was that the old lowest price technically available standard, which may be okay if you're buying screws, should not be the thing that applies to cyber or technology. So and I say that as a former venture capitalist, particularly to those of you who are here as smaller companies, more innovative, maybe not some of the, I'm all good friends with all the big guys too, but this is different, and we have now allowed the Defense Department to look at other than lowest price possible. How can we actually get value rather than simply lowest price? I think terribly, terribly important, because if we're going to be innovative, we're really going to need to do more of that. Second thing that we are trying to do is part of this, as you all know, for those who work in the government, is we have these crazy one-year budgets. And so constantly spend down at the end of September. Here's a fun statistic that you might not all have. Of the $88 billion that the feds spent last year on IT, $75 billion of that was spent on simply patching and upgrading old systems. Think about the fact that when was the last time the federal government ever junked a legacy system? Instead, because of the inability to kind of think about long-term capital purchases, we continue to patch, and as you know better than I, every time we patch, we add a new cyber vulnerability. So my hope would be this may be an area where, again, we could find some bipartisan consensus to say, hey, it is actually cheaper in the long run when we think about both effectiveness of our systems and security of our systems to go ahead and make a capital purchase that might mean fully getting rid of some 1970s, 1980s, 1990s kludged together system that really doesn't work. And we've got legislation on that as well. One's called the MOVE It Act, and one's called the Rapid Innovation Act. Well, I don't know. I always wonder who makes up the titles of these bills, but it's somebody in the staff office, I guess. But on the Rapid Innovation Act, one of the things that we're trying to do as well, and this I know from the Intel side sometimes causes some controversy, is when we think about where all of the expertise is going to reside. But we'd like to see if we could empower DHS to have at least part of its activities in terms of innovation, almost create an NIH-type model, the way NIH serves for healthcare, a NIH-type model. I think probably within the DHS framework, but I'm open for better suggestions on how we might do that kind of basic research. Again, as the Admiral said, in concert with everybody from the private sector. I had a much longer speech. You're getting just the highlights, which is, first, from a politician, is always better to get the highlights in the whole speech. Other areas, workforce. 350,000 jobs available, 36,000 in Virginia available. We know many of these are advanced degree jobs, but many of them are community college jobs as well. And let me take off my senator hat for a moment and put on my Virginia hat. We got to do a couple things. One, we've got to give DoD, DHS, the intel community more flexibility in hiring. And I frankly think, in terms of cyber, the ability for people, in terms of the classifications, to move from the private sector to the public sector and back and forth. The idea that anybody is going to stay at the same company for 30 or 40 years, especially in a domain like cyber, one, it's not going to happen at all in the 21st century, and particularly in an area like cyber. And classifications and security clearances continues to be a challenge. So how do you help me figure out policies that can improve the personnel movement so that people can gain experience? And I say this, not only as somebody who realizes a lot of y'all, if you're in the private sector, might live in Virginia, but I want your expertise also to have be accessed by the federal government in terms of security. So we've got to do a better job on that. On a Virginia pitch, we are one of the first states, if not the first state, that's actually, by 2000, I think it's 18 or 19, going to make sure that computer coding is required in high school, which it is a step forward. And I don't care whether you call it language or science. But the idea that basic coding ought to be part of a basic curriculum for any kid, whether they want to be liberal arts or STEM, makes enormous sense to me. 2, we've created $1 million scholarship grant. 3, working with the governor, and the governor's been very good on this as well. We just held a cyber fusion competition and job fair down at VMI, had 11 teams from around the Commonwealth. We hope to expand it to virtually all of our colleges and community colleges. We've got, at this point, I think 12 of our community college cyber certified. We hope to get them all cyber certified within the next year plus. And while we've got those 36,000 jobs that are open in Virginia, and when I go talk to other groups, I say average starting salary about $88,000, which gets kids' attentions pretty quickly. We still have in Virginia already, because of our both combined private sector and public sector, over 85,000 jobs. We have a bigger cyber workforce in Virginia, candidly, than our friends in California, and that's why FireEye ought to go ahead and move its headquarters back to Virginia, as opposed to being out in California or, any of you all across the river in that higher tax state. Hey, I was a governor more longer than I've been a senator. Not really, but been a business guy longer than I've been either one. So, but it really is, essential that I think we find a way to forge public-private partnerships around education, around workforce. Candidly, government doesn't do a very good job on workforce training programs. It would be much better to partner with business in terms of this training. So if we can give these kids basic coding, if we can make sure our schools are appropriately got the curriculum, you've got to then help work with the schools in terms of initial access, but also then in terms of continuing upgrading of skills. And I'm going to have some new legislation on that I think will be fairly dramatic, because we've got to change the whole workforce framework, because, again, nobody's going to stay in the same job for 30 years. Final point was just the fact that we also have some new bipartisan legislation, House and Senate, that will start allowing DHS to make some cyber state grants. If you think the feds have challenges on cyber, as a former governor, let me tell you, the states are exponentially worse. And when we get down to the local level, particularly as we think about law enforcement and first responders, we are extraordinarily vulnerable. So a little bit of dollar to states that can be done, then distributed, particularly on the first responder side, will be, I think, a dramatic improvement. 2 last comments, and then I'll run back to the Hill. One is, and I'd like to leave you with as much optimism as the Admiral, but you know where I work. One is, this field, and I've been talking to cyber groups for almost a decade, your time has arrived. This is the age of cyber, and there's wide swaths of our population that will never fully understand what you all do. You need as an industry, and we need as policymakers, or the Admiral in terms of our military, needs to do a better job of explaining how extraordinarily essential your role is. It's not a question of when the next or if the next massive cyber event is going to happen. It's only a question of when. And while we've seen OPM and Anthem and Target and all these other leaks and breaches, in many ways that pales in comparison to what the Russians did just in the public domain in this last election. When you have not only selective hacking and leaks on a basis that favored one candidate over another, regardless of who you favored as candidates, the fact that the first John Podesta email leak came out within 4 hours of the so-called Access Hollywood tape was not a coincidence. The fact that there were close to 1,000 Russian internet trolls creating botnets that overwhelmed the algorithms of a lot of our platform companies. And if you were to ever happen to Google election hacking for the weeks before the election and afterwards, you wouldn't get Fox News or CBS or ABC. You get RT News, Sputnik, and a host of other Russian propaganda sites. And what happened in America is happening right now in France and Germany, and in even more obvious ways. And again, regardless of who you favored, when you've got a foreign country, in this case a foreign adversary, intervening massively in our electoral process, that goes to the heart of who and what we are as a country. And in many ways, you guys are the first responders. You're going to be the folks that identify that. One of the things that has frustrated me terribly has been there's not been more kind of American outrage about what happened. And if we don't continually be vigilant, and I think the Admiral's comment I loved about the offensive guys versus the defensive guys, the offensive guys need to only be right once, the defensive guys need to be right 99.9% of the time, then we're going to see not only monetary loss, intellectual property loss, but when you attack our basic democratic principles, that goes to the heart of our country. So I thank you for what you do. I thank FireEye for holding this conference. I want to tell you, and I don't know if Rosie in the back can raise her hand, I am chair of the Cyber Caucus, but as somebody who will acknowledge that my technology competency ended 15 years ago in many ways, we are wide open for business in terms of ideas, suggestions, how we do stuff better. As a former business guy, clearly this is a place, especially in terms of IT, where we can do a lot better job than we've done so far. But help us get this right. If we get this right, then I will share the optimism of the Admiral. Our country will continue to prosper and do great things going forward. Thank you all very much.